Welcome to the WAAS panel on culture and system change. We have a group of distinguished panelists. Two of our panelists, Piero and Rama, were unable to make it because of illness and power outages. Nadine BLOCH is going to replace Peter Joseph on the panel. Julene and I, the co-moderators, look forward to learning more about your ideas and work. I'll frame up the session with a few thoughts about system change, then we'll progress through a series of questions that will guide the panel. I was moved by many of the comments in Monday's opening sessions. Ivo Slaus said that society will end in 10 years if we do not change our economic and political paradigms.
Yeah.
Alberto Zucconi said that we are at war with each other and nature. Many people even are at war with themselves. Our disempowering culture and high-stress society fill many people with inadequacy, fear, and unhappiness. But in spite of these problems, I was uplifted by the excellent opening video. Gary Jacobs discussed the tremendous progress of humanity. We've accomplished many things that once seemed impossible. Jonathan Granoff said that we have the ability to end poverty and hunger and resolve all major challenges. The transdisciplinary approach of WAAS is essential for the progress of humanity. I feel it's an honor to be part of the Academy and its noble mission. The subject of our panel, system change, is broad. It can mean many things and refer to many levels, from the individual to the whole system. System change related topics such as systems theory and economic reform have been addressed at least since the 1970s. Humanity has experienced system change throughout history, especially since the agricultural revolution, when we started violating the laws of nature. System change can happen in two basic ways, voluntary or involuntary. High-level system change, such as economic and political change, often happens involuntarily and quickly. Examples include the American and French revolutions, the end of slavery in the US, and the collapse of communism in the USSR. Changing overarching systems can seem overwhelmingly complex. This makes voluntary system change difficult. Vested interests often fight to maintain current systems. This is a main reason why high-level system change often happens quickly. Vested interests block change until resistance becomes futile, then systems quickly collapse. If current systems change involuntarily through collapse, we could face unprecedented suffering and chaos because human society is larger and more interconnected than ever before, and we are close to or beyond many environmental and social tipping points. Things are accelerating. We almost certainly have entered the phase of involuntary high-level system change. As Ivo said, we probably don't have much time to convert it to voluntary system change. Many factors indicate that involuntary system change has begun, including COVID and the rapid decline of democracy in the US. Millions of people were emotionally manipulated by deceptive media into supporting President Trump's anti-democratic efforts to overturn a fair election that he lost. Climate change is just one of the many rapidly growing environmental, social, and economic challenges facing humanity. As others have said at the conference, reductionistic thinking and the flawed systems that inevitably result from it are the root causes of these challenges. Flawed economic and political systems unintentionally compel companies to degrade the environment and society. System change is the most important action needed to resolve major challenges. As Alberto said, we cannot achieve system change through reductionistic approaches. This is what caused the problems in the first place. All major aspects of society are connected. As a result, whole system approaches are needed. We'll discuss this in our panel. Three key issues about system change are collaboration, culture, and process versus content. Collaboration is essential for achieving high-level system change. No organization or even segment of society can change overarching systems on their own. Regarding culture, current society is a reflection of our reductionistic thinking. All voluntary change begins in the mind. We must change at least some minds to change our systems. Regarding system change process versus content, many system change approaches focus on the process of initiating and managing collaborative system change efforts. Content refers to the actual system changes needed. Most system change processes have a contextual phase that identifies systemic barriers and necessary changes. In other words, process often precedes content, but content frequently should take priority. Identifying content up front illuminates optimal system change processes and participants. One goal of this session is to help WAAS consider how to address system change in culture. Our panelists are doing excellent work in this area. Possibly we could suggest helping to move this work along. Julene also suggested establishing an online system change group. As we move through the panel questions, please introduce yourselves and limit your comments to a few minutes. We'll each have several opportunities to share. In addition to being moderators, Julene and I are panelists. Julene, would you like to address the first question? What is system change and how can it be achieved?
Sure. Thank you, Frank, for that great introduction. Indeed, we are in a planetary moment, and systems change, the way I've done it, aligned with you, is putting humanity and the environment at the center and essentially looking at what's blocking human and environmental flourishing. And the model that I've been working with is centered around epidemiology or public health, because I work a lot with the arts, and there is a lot you can do for the brain, for different diseases, for acting on social detriments of health with the arts, and especially since we're talking about a process of behavioral change, right? Understand changes within ourselves, changes within information, reordering bodies of knowledge. There's a lot that we can do for narrative change, change in mindsets, catalyzing social movements with the arts. So that's most definitely been my work. Understanding that mechanisms and mindsets are systems change. So the first part that I just spoke about, mindsets and behavior. The second set is mechanisms, how institutions can act violently on populations, creating a metrics of index, over 50 indicators for looking at how to better align institutions with the natural world. Essentially, we institutionalize what we understand. And at the heart of an institution is the incentives. What are the incentives behind it? What are, and how sustainable are those? What is the level? Dialogue is a key point. Anti-dialogic institutions are lack I won't get too much into the metrics of it, but essentially what we're talking about with systems change is addressing mindsets, behavior, social processes, and institutional and structural change. Because we can talk about catalyzing change with the arts, but I think what also we have to talk about is how are social forces being mobilized? They're being mobilized by the incentives of our institutions, which are in fact, incentives such as limitless growth are completely unsustainable. You only have to look at the statistics on work-related trauma to know that, the way institutions are operating is in fact detrimental to public health. So systems change, the way that I look at it, the two main facets that I've been looking at are behavioral and mindsets, culture, and institutional and structural change, and how we can actually how injustice is in fact rooted in systems architecture, in the very architecture of our global systems and our most predominant and powerful systems, and how we can go about a process of moving from one system to the next through the metrics that I've been building with institutional, indicators, as well as processes with behavior and mindset. So that's my take on it. But I know we have some very brilliant people here today. The base of my approach is both mechanisms and mindsets, and in particular with the arts, I look at reordering knowledge, reordering narratives, how institutions value certain forms of knowledge and degrade others, and how that relates to the way that we degrade different populations, cultures, that host different types of knowledge. So, that's a very, very high level, but I hope I can, I'm bringing up the knowledge point because I know Nora Bateson is here and she's done some great work in that kind of area. So I'm gonna leave it there because I know we have, that's a high level summary. but I'll pass it over. Maybe Nora, if you want to take up just a high-level summary as well from you.
Well, first of all, it's great to be with all of you, and of course, this is a very important conversation, and it's a tricky conversation. It's a tricky conversation because the urgency, as you've already stated, is creeping up fast, and I think, you know, we're no longer talking about when we're in systems transformation, we're in it. So who are we? How are we in it? This is the question for me right now. What is it? I don't think we're going to be creating systems change. The systems are already changing. At this point, the question is, how are we in relation to those institutions that are shifting, in relation to each other, in relation to previous and future generations, in relation to the natural world and the land. Most importantly, in relation to a whole ecology of ideas. Some of those ideas that are the most pernicious and dangerous are actually ideas about change, ideas about being actors and agents of change, ideas about being instigators and doers and leaders of change, ideas that position the human experience in direct contrast to the type of patternings and relationings that we see in a living system, in a meadow, in a forest. What is change? What does it mean to have agency? I mean, I think these are some questions that require some very careful thinking. One of the spooky things that I'm finding right now is that a good deal of the discussion around systems transformation is actually populated with very trendy language. And these languagings are, unfortunately, they were words that were pulled in by, you know, the sort of the old guard of the people who created cybernetics, systems theory, complexity theory, some chaos theory. And they're kind of mixed with some indigenous languaging as well. Very little, I think very little tribute is given to the depth of indigenous understanding of systems change. But I'm concerned about the language. I'm concerned about the way in which we could use systems theory and complexity theory as a way to engineer, manage, and otherwise control systems change. And the reason this is of great concern is because, in fact, those intentions are the same kind of intentions that got us here to begin with. So there's a very real possibility that in our attempt to create systems change, we're perpetuating the existing systems in some of the worst possible ways. The amount of competition in the field of collaboration is fantastic right now. The lack of integrity in actually the change maker space. There's quite a bit of I think very real danger that if there is not an uptick in care and attentiveness, not only to the language, but to each other, and to the way in which even our description of systems change holds a perception, okay? It holds a perception. And that perception is not of the real world. That perception is of our perceptions. and I'm not trying to be tricky here. This is a very real issue. Our capacity to observe is actually through the filters of our past. And so anything that we observe and describe is going to be contaminated with those impulses in some very good ways and also in some dangerous ways. So I think that for me, I know there's a lot that all of you are going to bring up. So this is something I can pop in that's a little different, to just say, I think we have to be really careful right now. I'll stop there. I think there's beautiful things happening, and we should, care is needed.
Thank you. That's a fantastic point about the idea that the current system change in processes might actually be keeping current systems in place. I'd love to explore that one more. But as we work down through the agenda, answering the first question, what is system change and how can it be achieved? Barry, would you like to go next?
All right, thank you. As you asked, I'll introduce myself, as people may not know me. I'm the editor-in-chief of a multidisciplinary journal published by Routledge, which is called Globalizations. And I'm a professor of global development studies at the University of Helsinki and a founding member and director of the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives Initiative. So I want to say, and also in my earlier days in youth, I worked on world system theory without a hyphen with the late Andre Gunder Frank, rather extensively. So I take a very longue durée view of the world system. So I wanted to pose first the difference between system change and system transformation, because you can distinguish intellectually, conceptually, between change within a system. A system which has basically got a structure which continues to reproduce itself, where there's continuity. There may be patterns, cycles, secular trends, rhythms, etc., periodic crises, but within the same system. And then you have radical system change, or I actually want to discuss the utility of using the term system transformation, because it looks like we are talking about, I think I agree with Ivo Slaus and many others that, look, this is an absolutely pivotal period in human history, full scale, of all periods of human history. This one is an acute existential crisis. Okay, now that's a starting point, we know that. The particular system that we have now, that we've inherited, that's accelerated its extractivist and destructive ecological ecocide tendencies in the last 50 years or even 30, it's now imploding. And my view is it's what I call a great implosion. To keep it sustained in its without any radical change to the structure will fail. So we do face this really intense moment for mobilization. So I wanted to say something about that, because we all know that, if you read, everybody's looked at Stefan et al.'s article on trajectories of the Earth system in the Anthropocene and some other things that people have done of similar kind, and that carbon brief. There are now maps of the tipping point zones across the world. Tim Lenton did, years ago, and so on. That we now know that, look, this situation is far more dangerous even than the matter of greenhouse gases per se, or carbon reductions per se, or decarbonization. It really has to do with ecological restoration, which is now absolutely imperative that it happen on a planetary scale. I mean, you've probably seen that David Attenborough's film, A Life on This Planet, and now he has a new series. I mean, it's his life testimony. He's seen it happen. He documents it. People can now see it on the film and maybe help to understand the moment, the planetary moment that we're in. So, I mean, as far as like what I would call about system transformation now, it really is about, and I think most of us would probably agree, it obviously is about overcoming the false economic paradigm where you have inbuilt externalities that are a fiction. The idea that all the damage you do to the environment is somehow not in the accounting model, so it doesn't matter. But that's not even real. Of course it matters, and we now know about planetary boundaries, tipping points, thresholds, and the interactions between all of those, because it's one integrated system. It just is. That's the truth. So we really have a huge task of transformation. I'm kind of inspired by I mean, we need to reimagine civilization, and Nora is part of that project we're doing. In what ways? But like David Wallace Wells in that book, The Uninhabitable Earth, which I hope you've read, one of the things he concludes on at the end, after cataloging all the dire trajectories of the data tells us that we're experiencing or happening, he concludes on saying there's one thing about climate models, you know, however sophisticated they are, and they become ever more so. There's the most important single variable that isn't in them happens to be us. And that happens to be the human agency, the human will, the human mentality, a spiritual and mental revolution, long overdue. And in a way, it's maybe full circle with certain kinds of ancient indigenous cosmovisions and understanding the earth as a sacred web of life, which it is. I think it is. Many people do. We have to return to that attitude and then act. So, I mean, I'm very encouraged by multi-convergences that I see happening. There are many of them, like whole, you know, networks of networks. And I was just at the Virtual World Social Forum not very long ago, and there was a panel that I participated in on like a global dialogue process between about 8 multi-convergence initiatives around the world. You know, this kind of thing is happening. And the last thing I'll say is that one great advantage I think we have at this moment, and we have to use for everything is worth, is that we have now an enabling technology like we're using right now, which you know, amplifies the ability of human reflexivity and accelerates our ability to learn, and then our ability to reach common understandings and then take collective action. And that even on a planetary coordinated basis, which we're going to have to do, as well as all the kind of local actions. But I don't believe in any reality. But I think the global is always instantiated or embedded in the local. So I think it's a false dichotomy to say local versus global. I don't agree with that. I never have. So I think I'll leave it at that. You know, that we have to move to a new paradigm of Earth stewardship. This is clear. We have to radically change the practices on fossil fuels, on land use. You know, agriculture, forestry, you know all this. It's comprehensive, and that's the challenge. And in a way, you know, it's imperative. We don't really have a choice if we're sane, and we take a moral stance. Because I mean, I have a 4-year-old granddaughter, and you know, by the end of the century, I hope she'll be alive. She'll be in her 80s. In other words, this century is her life. So like, I like that old saying that comes from indigenous people that, you know, we don't inherit the land from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Barry. I knew this was going to be a rich panel. Petra, would you like to take go next with the first question? What is system change and how can we achieve it?
Yeah, I can actually very much relate to what has been said so far. So I'm Petra, I'm the Executive Director of the Collective Leadership Institute. We are internationally operating NGO, and in a lot of transformation processes that are, if you consider systems change small, but there are big systems like the cocoa value chain, the coffee value chain, educational systems, etc. So, and why this is so important is that what I've learned from these transformation processes that seem to be small, but they aren't actually, they're hugely complex with multiple stakeholders, is that indeed, and I agree with Nora and with Julene here, and Barry, I think you also touched on this, that there is a unique combination that we need to bring into stronger awareness. And that's my first point. That is the connection between self, between system, whatever the larger system is, you know, it would be organizational, it could be local, it could be global, and the process, because the process is so increasingly important, because if we do the process like we did the old, then we're going to create the old. So we need to do the processes so that they model the new and not the old. And that is in itself a huge learning process, you know, for which we don't really have kind of entire answers. So in my experience, what really helped and what resonates quite a lot with people is that I developed a you know, kind of, it's a whole theory, it's a concept, but it's actually based in practice, and that is the what I call the aliveness approach, and that is so important to look at the systems that we would like to build, and ask ourselves what gives lives to systems. If we understand that in small systems, we can also understand that and bring it into larger systems. And there is a very close relationship between what creates aliveness in ourselves and what creates aliveness in the systems that we're operating in the processes, how we do transformation processes, and in the systems that we would like to achieve. I'm currently involved in a project with young professional women on creating a new economic architecture. And this is a hugely ambitious project where it's really about asking the questions, what would be an economy in service of life, in service of aliveness. So that turned out to be a quite inspiring way of looking at things. And this is so important because the issue is, and I don't want to get in the wording of systems change or systems transformation, because both I feel uncomfortable with, because like 30 years ago, systems change was about communism and capitalism. And today, you know, it's a different connotation. And systems change, I mean, we've been talking about this since the 80s. So it has been in kind of many fora, you know, kind of the focus. And it's clear that we have achieved a world in terms of how we operate with the planet, that we have to do much more conscious, deliberate transformative processes. But what I find so exciting is, and that's a point that I would like to raise here, is you know, our friend Maya Goepel, that, you know, some of you may know, she says we actually need radical incremental transformation. And I love the combination of radical and incremental, because the issue is, if we look at the current situation and just flip side, the way we perceive the world, and at the moment we perceive the enormous pressure, and this is justified, the pressure that we really get into collective action, change behavior, do things different at scale. But we also know that the actual change of the system will take place on the local level. So it's not going to be a top-down decision. You know, it's going to be top-down, bottom-up, but both terms may not be the right terms. You know, it is happening everywhere. So what I find so interesting, if you just flip that and say, let's look at what is already happening and not what is not happening, because most people kind of complain about what is not happening. But if you look at what is already happening, then the question is slightly different. The question is, how can we connect what is already happening, which is, you know, kind of, Barry, you mentioned this in kind of convergence kind of initiatives. How can we connect what is already happening? How can we amplify mindsets that are modeling the future? And these are all mindsets that have a completely different relationality with our role vis-a-vis the planet, vis-a-vis nature, vis-a-vis each other. Nora, you were talking about care. But it is already existing. There are so many I don't know, implementation, the projects, the initiatives. It's not just about global things, it's many local things. And there is a huge knowledge and wisdom, not the least the indigenous wisdom, that actually gives us the models of the future. And it sounds a little bit, as if I want to go back to the past. No, but somehow, and I found a brilliant quote from somebody who was working on mythology. She says, you know, the future is emerging into the past. So it means that we need to pick up elements from the past in order to be able to go into a future. So the issue really is about, and that's why the academy is also so important. It is really about more consciously bringing together what is already walking towards the right direction. And then, of course, we're not going to agree what exactly is the right direction and how exactly a new civilization is going to look like, because, you know, we need to have inspiring narratives. That's why I work best with aliveness narratives, but the pathways need to be plural, because only if the pathway is plural, they are plural. They can take place in South Africa and India and Philippines in a different way than in Finland and in Germany. And still, you know, if there is a responsibility towards the future and a responsibility towards our place on this planet in terms of place also in nature, then a collaboration between these different networks are important. So the issue about networks is indeed important, but not just networks that are narrowing around a certain identity and just exchanging, but networks in a really kind of mutually respectful, coordinated way. And so I believe that increasingly terms like Earth stewardship, you know, like the Anthropocene article took this up, Earth stewardship, or I call it collective stewardship, are terms that are becoming more and more important, because we cannot control the future and we cannot control the systems change. We cannot walk with the old methodologies that caused the trouble into the future. And yet we already have the future methodologies, and some of them are ancient, some of them are very old, and we need to kind of pick them up and look at the Chinese philosophy, look at the Buddhist philosophy, look at the Vedanta, look at, you know, I mean, and you can also look at the Celtic philosophy. I mean, like there are lots of different places, or African philosophy. So it is about, it is indeed about collective stewardship. And I like the term stewardship because it means that the future is somehow entrusted to us. We cannot determine the future. We cannot control it. We need to walk with a high degree of humility and a high degree of mutual respect. But at the same time, we need to be more active, more conscious about human agency. And what is even important, and that is something that we shouldn't forget. If you look at successful transformation networks, and no matter if they are sustainable coffee value chains or getting gay marriages into laws, every protected transformative process somehow needs to materialize in structure, in institutions. So it is absolutely important that we think about, not maybe now, it's not immediately, but not forget that it's not just about dialogue and thinking differently and being nice with each other, but really saying, how does this need to materialize in already existing systems, because laws are existing systems, but how can the future be anchored in systems that we have, in institutions that we have, or institutions that we need to create? So that would be my contribution.
That's beautiful, Petra. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. A lot of really, really great ideas there. And I'm very inspired by your aliveness narrative. I've done a lot of work with narrative, I think also has Nadine, who I'm going to introduce next. I love your idea of making an economics that work for life, right? And absolutely, we're in this process of systems change. We're in it. And one of the things that you mentioned is that the fact that, yeah, it's top down, but it's also bottom up. The local action will also be a big player in us coming together for changing our systems. Nadine BLOCH has a lot of experience in working with local activists and social movements, in particular with arts-based methods, which they have a toolkit of, I don't even want to say how many case studies, tactics, principles, strategies that they've put together. But it's a phenomenal voice of human agency. And also for me, we have to acknowledge the amount of suffering that's been caused by systemic violence. And although, you know, activists, I take Nora's point, it does go up and down in terms of what you get, but at the same time, that chaos, I think, is coming from the violence that has been imposed on populations, the oppression, the inequality of socioeconomic inequality, things like that. And I find arts an amazing language for dealing with all of those things. So I think the role of the arts in cultural change, local change is very important. And with that, I will pass it over to Nadine.
Oh, thank you, Julene. Thanks, Petra, Barry, Nora, Frank, everyone for speaking. I'll do a mini introduction and then say a few words, and I love the back and forth. So my name is Nadine BLOCH. I am a practitioner, an artist, an activist, strategist in people-powered social movements. I am also the training director for Beautiful Trouble. We are a group who we say that is dedicated to making revolution irresistible. Thank you, Tony Cade Bambara, for that framing. And just to speak a little bit more, and our website is beautifultrouble.org for folks who want to look at it, available in about 5 languages at the moment. And what we do is we do start with storytelling. So our intersection with system change, if you will, and the way I use the term system change is really, I'm thinking right now about these exploitative systems that we need to transform, and that's the word that we use, transform, not change, within the system, but to try to think outside of the systems that we're all embedded in, which in and of itself, as we have mentioned, is quite difficult. We have to create, in the moment, embedded in these exploitative systems, a new way or an old way, right? Reintegrating old ways is fine, or a new way that integrates old ways and moves towards the future of right relationship with each other. And actually, to start that off, I also wanted to say I'm calling in from outside of Washington, D.C. This is the land of the Piscataway or the Nakachank originally. And I just want to acknowledge the land that I'm calling in from and acknowledge who's on this call as well. And who's not on the call, so that we're having this conversation. One of the things that Beautiful Trouble does, to get back to it, is that we have a pattern language approach to social change, right? And we seek to help social movements document and then generalize or articulate and then apply their insights and their breakthroughs in ways that they can learn from and that others can learn from, and that they can experiment with in their own context. And this means, and that the reason why we're there is because we understand this power of arts and storytelling and culture to engage people, not just in their hearts, but in their bodies, in their guts, to really connect on a level that will motivate them to take action. And I think this was mentioned, that all of this talk really comes down to what is the concrete manifestation in already existing systems or ways that we're living that will enable us to then build towards a future that is healthier, more peaceful, more sustainable. In fact, more of a place where each person feels their own agency and ability to take action and craft the future that will serve them. And that's the essential place that arts and culture, or the essential role that arts and culture plays in communicating that everyone has a place in this work, that the stories and the histories and the ancestors who we stand on and all of the learnings that we have brought with us to this moment are going to be critical in mobilizing and energizing people to be actively engaged, to embrace their agency. And I think I'm also not only a scientist, an artist, but I was trained as a scientist in the early days of my undergraduate work. I actually contributed to the research done on the nuclear winter theory that was promoted by Carl Sagan and others. And folks may remember that was a great moment thinking about ecosystem services as we framed it, right? How the potential explosions of a nuclear bomb would actually obliterate the ability of phytoplankton, plants in the ocean, to then create oxygen. And that whole picture of how we're all integrated and basically part of this ecosystem, as we're all talking about, that we rely on for life, I think is really critical to our understanding of how we are all connected to each other as individuals as well. And I know this radical incremental transformation is a concept that we build on because we understand that change does happen at a local level, I think, and that it can filter up and across as well as in many other directions. And we can learn a lot from the ecosystem and the networks that the fungi engage in, for example, in their work in providing us with what we need to live here on this planet. And so as artists and as cultural workers, there is not one size fits all. And I think this is another really important thing. The old way, or the past capitalistic system way of thinking, is that the bigger the grid, the one way we deliver energy, the one solution, the mass production of whether it's clothing or food or any of these things is the way to go. And what we find when we look at solutionary work, and we engage in arts and culture, is that in fact, the solutions are as individualistic as the people who are engaged. So we know that the arts and culture can contribute to the emotional, the psychological, the real commitment of folks to take action. We know from studying change in our systems towards democratic principles and activities and governments that people-powered movements, nonviolent movements, are twice as effective as those that rely on violence. And the reason that is essentially is because of numbers. Movements that embrace creative resistance are open to more people. They're more accessible. There's a lower bar to entry. You don't have to be young and willing to pick up a weapon to engage in it. You have to be able to bring your full self and your arts, your culture, your communication styles, your dialogue, potential, all of this with you, and have a variety of ways of engaging people and moving them to take action. So I think there's a lot to learn from studying our stories of change and engagement. And that's where we start as Beautiful Trouble. And then we try to make these principles, theories, tactics more accessible so that we can have more effective people-powered movements across the board to make change at global, local, community, state, national levels, to work towards this bigger vision, this multiplicity of bigger visions that include healthier future for people and the planet. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadine. So many great ideas. I love the idea of empowering people to feel they can contribute to system change, because I suspect for many people it seems overwhelming. What can I do to change the economic and political system? And then I also thought the idea that art and culture, a purpose of that is to show us that everyone has a role to play in system change. Beautiful ideas. Next on our panel, and I apologize in advance if I pronounce your name incorrectly. Is it João?
I'm used to several pronunciations, and you know, in the end, it's always me. I haven't changed yet. So, no, I don't worry. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Well, change, transformation, those are very big words, juggernaut words. In fact, they have many meanings. I'm a physicist by training, so I take the scientist's view of change to say, and especially this notion of systems change, especially because we are at the moment, in this moment, we are undergoing a tremendous change between ourselves. I mean, in our way of communicating, close contact, close physical contact, I mean, has become a sin. And we are not used to it. Well, it has happened before in history, you know, but I'm sure that every time it happened, it was really, you know, a very troublesome epoch that provoked lots of change, transformation. So evolution is another way, another word that we can put in here. And here is what is systems change. Well, systems are made of nodes and connections. Sometimes there are nodules in the middle of that, like networks. Well, they correspond to institutions. But one thing about systems is that they work for a purpose, and especially living systems, they work for a purpose. And we can say that from a very simple way, that change, what it means, change is adaptation. adaptation. We all know that there are adaptations that do not work at all, adaptations who are successful, adaptations that are very strenuous, other ones that are almost insignificant, don't make any difference at all. So we in society and in ourselves, we have witnessed, and we are in the mood of not knowing if we are changing in terms of if you have to change our societies in what direction. But that is common. The notion here of going into the future, we know that in fact the game of evolution is adaptation, and futurologists say that the best way to adapt to change is to invent the future, and so you can go into it. But that connects already with culture. So we can have many ways of changing, and I'll cut it short. We can have a change in the purpose of the system that we are looking at. That's a sort of a composite, a global change. We can have change in the nodes. We can have change in the links. And we also can have change from the exterior of the system, whatever it is. So we have change from inside and change from the outside. And so this means that any system, especially any living system, is always in an environment where there are other living systems, and all of them want to, in fact, keep going, because that's what life is about, and we are not different from the other ones. And this is this continuous fight or drive for survival that is the main engine of change. Of course, in situations where we probably thought that change was outside change was very small, and population, in fact, was changing slowly. Well, this didn't have any big significance at all. But nowadays, we just feel it very, 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 very strongly. So I would leave it here in terms of of saying that we are in fact no more than everything else living on Earth. Well, we have some difference. We have a very powerful means of communication. That was, in fact, one of the latest stage in evolution of living beings, as the biologists say, evolution of biologists. So, well, we have to use this fantastic means of communication to keep, in fact, our capacity of living on our planet and maybe elsewhere correctly. We cannot let this system sort of get out of the rails.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, João. I wanted to take a shot at, since I'm a panelist too, at the question of what is system change and how can we achieve it. And I'd like to focus on the content side. There's a lot of great work on how do we bring people together and get them to work together on the process of system change. But as I also take more of a scientific view, like you just said, João, and think, well, what is it exactly that we have to change? What does it look like? And because if we can get a roadmap of the changes that are needed to get to sustainable society, then that will facilitate a lot of the process work. We'll have something to focus on. And one way to do that is with the laws of nature. The laws of nature define what have controlled whether or not species survive and prosper on this planet for 3.5 billion years. And that is 100% what will determine whether or not we stay or go. And so these laws provide, we can develop a very clear vision of what sustainable society is going to look like. We know what's going to happen on this planet. The only question is are we going to be here? And the answer to that is that if we abide by the laws of nature, then yes, we will be here. So what are those laws? There's many of them. They're really conditions for sustainable systems at all different levels. There are some that we're all familiar with, like the circular economy principles, limiting growth, producing no waste, living off of renewable resources, but also implied operating principles of nature are equitable resource distribution, cooperation, equally valuing current and future generations, equally valuing species, decentralizing governance and production, enabling individuals to reach their fullest potential. Also, implied operating principles of sustainable systems include democracy, full cost accounting, producing no externalities, equality, and full employment. Now, all of these things are wonderful moral ideas or philosophical ideas, but the problem with morality and philosophy is that you can get into endless debates, and that's one way that vested interests tie things up. These principles are also objective reality. It doesn't matter, nature doesn't care what humans think, say, or do. We'll either abide by its laws or we won't. If we don't like these principles, it doesn't matter. These are the facts of nature. So with that, equitable resource distribution, for example, or cooperation, some might have a philosophical view on that, but within the overwhelming force in nature is cooperation, not competition. Resources are distributed equitably. The SDGs, for example, provide a human-centric view of sustainability. They're a wonderful achievement, but the reality-based view for human sustainability is the laws of nature, not the SDGs. Abiding by them is the only way probably to achieve the SDGs. So there's the principle of putting the what before the how. Before we talk about how to change something, it's important to identify what is the change that we want. Once that's clear, then we can figure out how to achieve it. So when we can define what many aspects of sustainable society will look like. Once that's clear, that shows what are the systemic changes needed to get from here to there. I can't cover all of them, but I've written a lot about them in my books, Global System Change. But just to give 3 principles of system change. One is to emulate nature. Virtually all of the economic and political system changes that we need to make are implied or shown in nature. Another one is democracy. That's the only sustainable form of government because it's based on the innate equality and right to self-government of everyone. And maybe the most important principle, especially in the corporate and financial area for system change, is the rule of law. I spent many years looking at how companies were compelled to degrade the environment and society. There are many economic and political system flaws that force them to degrade life support systems and hurt different stakeholders, such as limited liability, time value of money, externalities, focusing on economic growth instead of social well-being, and many others. If you were to take all of the system flaws and roll them up into one overarching system flaw, it would be the failure to hold companies fully responsible for negative impacts. In competitive markets, this is what creates the mechanism where companies cannot mitigate and remain in business. If they try to voluntarily stop harming life support systems or stakeholders, they can make more money up to a certain point, but beyond a certain point, their costs go up and they die. So our systems unintentionally create a situation where companies must degrade life support systems and society to survive. Nobody intended that. It's the result of reductionism. The rule of law says, do whatever you want, but don't hurt anyone else. Our systems not only allow companies to harm the environment and society, they compel it. So that's why the rule of law essentially is non-debatable within the realm of logic. Companies can't argue that they should be allowed to harm the environment and society. It's a way to frame up system change that everyone can understand. Once you get down into the details of it, it's difficult, becomes very complex. Okay, so if I was laying out a roadmap for humanity to sustainability, the first, there'd be three parts. Well, there's many more, but three high-level parts. One is, what does sustainable society look like? Two, what are the system changes needed to get there? And three, what are the actions in all areas of society needed to bring about these changes? We need areas in government, action in government, the general public, and the corporate and financial. Government, the main change obviously is hold companies responsible. That way they make the most money by acting responsibly. But government largely is controlled by business, so we need business and the general public to push government to change. The people are the most powerful force in society collectively. If they work together, they could change any business or government, but it's easy to divide them and disempower them with deceptive media and other things. So in the US, we've got the conservative versus liberal civil war that's led to the insanity we're seeing here and made us unable to work together on our common interests. A main solution there, as was discussed in another panel on this conference, is require honest media. If Fox News shows Exxon scientists that says climate change isn't real, the fairness doctrine, which we got rid of in '87, would have said, now you have to show a scientist that explains why it is real. But half the country only hears from the Exxon or the oil company scientists, and they come to think that climate change is a scam to hurt the economy or something. And then we need action in the corporate and financial sector. Probably the single most important thing we could do to drive system change there is to use investing to engage companies in system change. We've successfully used responsible investing for 20 years to compel companies to implement sustainability strategies. We can use the exact same approach to get them to implement, engage in collaborative system change. Okay, so just a couple of final points. In terms of putting the what before the how, one way to think of it is first identify the changes that we need, and then the next step is to figure out what are the processes and communication strategies to achieve that. So for example, looking at nature, we know that in sustainable society, there won't be any limited liability, externalities, or time value of money. But if we go out and say to business and finance leaders who've been making money on these for their whole careers and say, yeah, we want to get rid of those things, that would not be an effective strategy. That's not going to facilitate voluntary system change. So just like if 200 years ago, if we went in the southern US, went and said, we need to get rid of slavery, that wouldn't have been the best way to approach it. So we have to help them understand the business case for system change, help them to see how these systems are harming you and improving them can benefit you. So one final point, there's no one correct way to do system change. We see here on this panel, there's many different wonderful ideas. They're all needed. There's no one right way. I think we need more work at the higher level. We talk about the community and the local level, but especially at the national level, economic and political systems severely constrain organizational and community system change efforts. So we do have to make, that's where the system flaws that I discussed are largely controlled at the national level. Companies who already engage with government can begin to engage in a different way and encourage them to basically, simple answer, hold us more responsible, then we make more money by acting more responsibly. So anyway, I love this rich panel. It's great to be a part of it. We had a series of questions that we were going to work through. We don't have to completely stick with them. I hope at the end we wind up with maybe an idea of how we could coalesce all this into a recommendation for WAAS around system change. But if moving through the questions, and the next one, and Nadine already touched on this, is what is the role of culture and art in system change? And then here people can just use the raise hand function if they'd like to contribute, or if you'd like to take the discussion in another direction, feel free to do so. And I might get in trouble for that, but go ahead anyway. Nora?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on something that came up earlier, but it actually ties together. So that works really well because You were speaking about how living systems are within living systems and that life is continuing. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think this is there's a depth that often gets missed in this piece of looking at the way that this biological continuing is actually, it is systems change. Always, of course it is. It has to be. Because what's really deadly is systems not change. Whatever that would be. Obsolescence is lying that way. And just to kind of bring into that and articulate it a little further and attach it into the art question. You know, if you think about the ways in which a meadow is meadowing, right? There are all these organisms that are, you could identify and study them as separate organisms. But what is really interesting is when you start to see the way in which these organisms are multiply providing vitality for each other, not in one way, in multiple ways. So the earthworm is earthworming along, and it's eating in the soil, and it's pooping in the soil, and it's producing the soil, and it's aerating the soil. And in that sense, it's creating the possibility for trees and plant life and other microbial life to exist. And it's also food for the birds and its proteins and its enzymes. And it's also what we take fishing. And it's also, right? So there's all these multiple ways in an ecology in which things get knitted together. And what's important about this in the question of systems change is the way in which these multiple knittings can shift, because they already are shifting, right? In order for a meadow to stay stable, it has to keep changing. So then there's this other piece there, which is that there's you and me, and we're sitting in that meadow. And we have an appreciation of the beauty of that meadow. We have poetry about that meadow. We have notions of love and spring. We have symbolism. We have all kinds of stuff that also knit our existence in an emotional, imaginational, cultural, linguistic way into that meadow. And this is where we often get lost. And one of the examples of this that is I think most, it's sort of low-hanging fruit, and maybe you could criticize it, but there was a moment when in the sort of peak popularity of the SDGs, President Macron tried to make a gas tax in keeping with that. And what was missing there, because the attempt to fold into a kind of new set of policies and structures and abide by coming into a new world and use the old world to create the new world. But there was a depth of personal experience, of culture, of language. There was a whole lot of transcontextual processes, and they got triggered, and they started to trigger. So one of the things that I think is most interesting is the question of how to think about all of the issues in a changing system and what we are doing, even talking about it. And can we begin to not only perceive, but also tend to these issues, not only in the first order, but in second, third, fourth order relational processes. So the temptation is to perceive the issue, to analyze the issue, and to start to create structure and maybe bring in other aspects of the system and try to knit them in. in a managerial function, but not to recognize how that set of relational process then taints and changes the next set of relational processes, the meta messages, the ways in which, I mean, frankly, we have a situation right now where at a political level, discussions of systems change and response to environmental climate have become highly polarized and politicized, yeah, even within our own families. So how to, recognize that whatever it is we're talking about, it's not just about going out there and making change. It's also about tending to the ways in which all kinds of internal processes are knitted in. And to me, this comes back to art. It comes back to art because art is, well, here's the thing. My grandfather, William, he coined the term genetics, right? And in 1888, he gave a description of systems and systems change. I'll put it in the chat in a minute. That is going to blow your mind. And it starts off by him saying, my brain is boiling with evolution. And what's happened is that he's recognized that in order for any organism to change, it has to change in relationship to the others. And he's really asking, like, what is change? And he used to say this thing, and he would say that—
Just watch time as well. So if you can just,
okay,
yeah.
Sorry. It's a cute story. And then I'll just, but that genius could only ever be seen in art and in nature. And that science should always be inspired by it, but it would never achieve it. And this is because of those multiplicitous ways in which these always responding processes are in relationship. And the only way that relationship can continue is if they change. So art, I mean, in a way, what I think we're looking at is actually a really desperate need for entirely new genres of art, where we can start to express experiences of being human that have never been expressed before. Yeah. Knit us into the ecology. There we go.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just gonna put a couple things in, sum up, and I know we got to go to questions and things as well. One of the things that we looked at in systemic engagement of the arts is understanding arts as a social knowledge system, being able to read what is embodied and embedded in the larger social order. Okay, and by understanding the arts in this way, you can understand most deeply the history, the experience, the levels, the relationships, the interrelationships of a country by the history of their dramaturgy, by the history of the music, because you can review it in these interfaceted relationship ways. And I'm just going to keep it to on the level of interrelationships. One of the things we put forward for bringing forward all systems change efforts. Life is lifing. Transformation is happening. At the same time, like Frank Dixon said, you know, nature's going to carry on doing what's doing. The question is, are we going to be here? And my concern is, are we going to shift the paradigm before it crashes? And one of the ways we have to address dysfunctions, but one of the ways is also this deeper level of what you're talking about of interrelationships, and how can we create more collective intelligence and inter-awareness, self-illuminating system of inter-awareness, because my interest is not to say there's one systems change method and that life is lifing and meadows are meadowing, but at the same time, I think this is about what can we put forward as a conscious effort, you know, with Barry's work, Petra's work, the local grassroots work that Nadine is doing. Can we come out of, well, we're not reductionist thinkers, clearly. But what could we do collectively and powerfully to think about better aligning social and natural systems? I'm just going to hand it over to panel questions or, yeah.
Well, I'll just make a quick point on that, and that is that, you know, nature is coordinated by the wisdom of nature. There's nobody whispering in a grasshopper's ear saying, take only what you want, but somehow through instinct or DNA or things we don't understand, nature produces essentially infinite cooperation in our bodies. We're nature too. We have the capacity to produce the same high level of cooperation, sophistication, technology already present in nature, and that comes through the intuitive. We're not taught how to use it. So that's a key part of it. You know, a key issue with sustainability is balancing power and wisdom. We have an abundance of power in the world, but not enough wisdom to use it correctly. We're destroying ourselves unintentionally. It's no coincidence, I think, that men are above women, because you know, men innately manifest greater physical strength, more aggressiveness. Women innately manifest on average more wisdom, more empathy, more cooperation. Those are the skills that we need to save the planet, but in a competitive, fear-filled world, they're not valued as highly as aggressiveness and competition. So how do we teach, as we teach boys and girls, men and women, the intuitive wisdom, cooperation, empathy, relationship skills, that'll, as we elevate wisdom, it'll naturally elevate women. And one key thing about art, Carl Jung pointed out that art, through the intuitive, the art often is a leading indicator of what's going to happen in society. You could look at before World War I and World War II, you could see some of the chaos showing up in the art in the 1920s. So, you know, what is art telling us now about what's going to be happening in the future? Maybe that's our crystal ball in some ways.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if Nadine wants to pop in with anything about the role of art in this systems change.
I definitely want to pop in for a minute. And in particular, broadening the term, I often call, I'm an artist, right? An activist artist. That's also one of the hats I wear, besides being just so committed to training and the power of training and education in the work that we do in mobilizing folks and helping people understand their own agency. And having said that, I don't often say I'm an artist. I would rather say I'm a cultural worker, or I engage people. I'm a way to talk to people about facilitation or engagement and reclaiming agency. And because, you know, in the end, what we're talking about is that if we can't learn to play nicely with each other, we're not going to be around, and perhaps we shouldn't be around if we can't learn to play nicely with each other. And so it's about how we work together and how we communicate, how we learn to dialogue versus debate. And in the end, how we facilitate or show up in spaces, and we understand now we use the term intersectionality of oppressions, or the interconnectedness of the world that we inhabit. And so even as we, you know, build the plane as we fly it, or as the Zapatistas say, you know, we walk forward together, questioning, or questioning we walk. How do we, it is really critical to have that full expanse of arts and culture, and to think about everything that we do more as an art rather than a science, because there are many answers, and the answers need to come from the communities and the culture that are actually engaged in the change or the movement towards a better vision on the front lines. And so Beautiful Trouble is an international network, a global collection of trainers and artists and activists and cultural workers who are really dedicated to helping people understand what has happened and where people can go and how they can much more effectively mobilize and make change on all of these multiplicity of levels. And that cultural element is critical to avoiding crises like you mentioned of Macron, and all kinds of other reinforcement or replication of the ways that we interact that are so harmful and are based in an exploitative corporate structure, corporate capitalist structure that is actually trying to externalize costs. And so the culture can really help us reclaim this work and what it means to us in our daily lives, and mobilize people to take action. And therefore will hopefully help us get to actual, you know, manifestations of laws and regulations and ways of change. I don't think we can leave this at this moment voluntary work on the part of corporations that are dedicated to prioritizing the bottom line over people. So I'll stop there.
Beautiful, thank you, Nadine. It's an interesting space between what you can catalyze with arts, but also what can you can watch as emergent knowledge and you know, the kinds of things that Nora Bates was talking about. But yeah, we've got 2 hands up, so I'll start with Petra. And if we can, I mean, I would like us to say, how can we, with all the different approaches and things like that, what can we do to really bring forward something powerful? I know Petra's done a lot of very practical work. So I'll take your hands up question, and then maybe you can also lead on or lead the way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Just maybe a word on arts, because I agree with Nadine that or, you know, I think Julene, you were also saying this, arts and culture are often modeling already the future. You know, they're like the spots into the future. Not only, of course, you know, there's lots of arts that actually is a way of healing the past. And of course, there are many more spaces in arts and culture. But I think what is very important, if we think about more deliberate transformative processes, that we reconnect. Interesting enough that I'm saying this here in this panel, arts and science. So because they actually belong together, but they have been severely disconnected, you know, also kind of up to the point that arts doesn't think that science is relevant, and science certainly doesn't think that arts are relevant. Yeah, so I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's how, you know, how it turns out. And that is so important. And that's another little thing where I think it's so interesting to observe how the transformations that lie in front of us. So I need to get hold of some aspects of the past, because if you go a couple of centuries back, then arts and science were always like closely connected. Yeah? So the intuitive and the rational wasn't completely disconnected as it is today. Yeah? And I do think what we can learn from that, and I mean, I'm not saying this is an easy decision to make, but in transformative processes, not just kind of saying we have a nice conference and then we get a singer in, or kind of a visual artist or whatever, but really making it much more of an integration, and making sure that the spaces for the creativity that arts bring in is really nurtured and is connected to the space that we create for the hardcore rational science. And so I do think we can become more creative in not adding arts to something else, but really having an integrated process. I think it's very fascinating if you look at futurists in Africa. You know, of course, they're not known. You know, most of them are not known, but these are huge cultures and subcultures where things are happening that we don't have a clue what is happening, but they are somehow living parts of the future that may be so extremely important for us. So my plea would be to go beyond. Also in the way we talk about transformation science, in the way we talk about kind of working towards systems transformation, that we actually reconnect with arts in a more generic way, and not just in picking that, you know, kind of showing something, or, you know, having nice pictures around, you know, but really a more intrinsic connection, acknowledging that this is a way of you know, whatever, cultivating the presence, rehabilitating the past, and also living the future that we need for our transformation processes. And I don't know if you want to move in what we could do collectively. Wow, yeah, I do think. What I find interesting here, and maybe there is really a step in I don't know, Frank, what your purpose was to also kind of go from here, yeah. But I do think it would be quite interesting to see number one, which transformative approaches seem to stick with people and work, yeah, and learn from the experience without getting in competition. You know, I don't want to kind of be competing with my aliveness approach, you know, with somebody else. Yeah, so that is not necessary, but it would be interesting to see also more on a generic level. You know, what creates resonance. Because we do have, I noticed we do have, I don't know what it is now, we do have a question in the question and answers on collective behavior change. And I do think collective behavior change, number one, it requires a combination of science and arts and not one or the other. And number two, the question is, how can we, Frank, I'm not going with laws, because laws are for me a little bit too far, and I would also say the laws of nature, we don't know yet. We don't know enough. There are so many things in nature, and just look at the communication of trees that we haven't been aware of, you know, kind of since recently. And so I wouldn't say laws, but are there generic insights that we can draw out together that are built on our practice, that are built on our maybe conceptual approaches, but in a combination of conceptual approaches and practice, that can be drawn out as I said, you know, I'm not for 5 steps to heaven or kind of 3 laws or whatever, but generic insights that help us to look at how to help people to become more aware of, you know, what would work in terms of collective behavior change, what would work in terms of looking at the world in a different way, because the mindset shift, Julene, you started with that, you know, it's so extremely important. The way we look at the world is, or the way we need to resurface how people look at the world, because many more people look differently at the world than what is mainstream looking at the world. So, yes. Maybe that's the work we can do together.
A lot of really good points. Thank you, Petra, for sharing. And I think one of the couple of things that you said were really key, right? It's like, if you understand, for example, arts is a social knowledge system, right? You know, all the interrelationships that Nora was talking about, then we have to be careful about how we engage it. What kind of participation, you know, not just having a performance on the side, that's not transformative. And actually, Center for Arts-Based Activism talk about this, that the creative process is baked in. It's not just something you do on the side. For a transformation process to take place, especially artistically based, the creative process is baked in from the very beginning, and it'll come out in the types of activities engaged, in the way the social structure is engaged. So I just want to tie together, because I know we're coming short on time, how we can move with the movements of nature that, you know, Nora's talking about, how we can engage those inter-reflections, multidimensional reflections, but how we can also, I just pulled up your website on together we build a new economic architecture. And when I read the word architecture, that symbol came up. And I think nature is an architecture. We have a lot to learn about that. But I think what we do know and have enough knowledge on is the current architecture is definitely not sustainable. What the new one is going to be a process, and we can use artistic and cultural means definitely as a key way to engage the transformative elements. But what if the arts and the culture and the us, our mindsets, our behavior, what if we are the art and the institutions we have created are in fact our science? Like in a sense, just think of institutional mechanics as the science, the collective way that we've organized ourselves. How can we move these two together? The art of us and the sort of structures that we've created. And I think it is about that key relationship on how we start reinstitutionalizing, remodeling, but identifying that that's not going to happen unless we move with nature in those natural motions that Nora was saying, and unless we create new narratives and new mindsets. Barry just sent a text on that. And in fact, one of the things that I've seen with the SDGs is, and all these great efforts, is a lack of a process for co-creative narratives, and in fact, a lack of a compelling narrative altogether with a momentous movement like the SDGs. And what's the compelling narrative, and how is that co-created? And what does that participation look like? And in fact, is that participation transformative or not? I'm asking these questions because there is a profound depth and beauty with moving with nature, absolutely. But I think a lot of those are being blocked in unhealthy ways. And we don't need to talk about all the environmental science and things like that. But how can we come together, right, for a new architecture, economic architecture, social architecture, as well as engage all this more beautiful depth, because it's infinite, isn't it, right, with nature, and create this transformative process that we all clearly have a piece of. We have a piece of it. And how can we sort of come together to do something quite powerful for what is a very uncertain future of this planet? And so I want to hand it out. What, maybe we can just respond to some of those and see what can we do together in a more collectively intelligent way to take some systemic processes and systemic action.
Joe has had his hand up. Would you like to go, Joe?
The thing is, we are also part of nature. So when we think we have to go with nature, we have to go with ourselves as well. And that's the very difficult thing. But when we are born, when suppose 10 little babies are born, and they grow up, at the beginning, they are all the same. They have, they experience very similar things. They suppose they live in the same village. But then as long as they grow up, they specialize somehow. Maybe 1 or 2 or 3 will become artists, and maybe 1 or 2 or 3 will become scientists. So what I'm trying to say is that, in fact, the notion of art and the notion of science are abstract notions. What exists really is artists and scientists and all the other capacities that we develop. And the difficulty with some of these activities we have is that for being able to express, to feel and to express our ways of looking to the outside, to society, to nature, to the universe, we have to develop very sophisticated languages. Very sophisticated languages, visual, oral, written languages that, in fact, only the specialists of the field can really handle. And that gives way a little bit to some incomprehension that goes on between many groups of people. You see, I was fascinated to see, for instance, that when we in this panel talk about nature, we are all in the same line of understanding that we are part of nature, and we are a species. We are all the same. We are different, different characteristics, but we are all equal, and so on. And this is a notion that was brought by science, and quite recently, in fact, in evolutive terms. I mean, decades ago, this was not common. People thought otherwise. So, in fact, these notions have to percolate, and we have to communicate these, and we have to evolve a vision that really goes on and encompasses all these views. It's very difficult, in my life, I have watched by the need of my profession. I held and watched many meetings of between art and science, and sometimes art being made by scientists, and science or scientific depictions or artifacts being made by artists and so on. And
we've got about 10, 15 minutes. So I want to make sure if you want to just round up, because I want to make sure we cover everything.
Yeah, I was just, I'll just take 1 minute to say that the difficulty is that for scientists, what artists do in science look like technology. It's not really science, you see, it's not sufficiently abstract. And for artists, you know, the kind of art that scientists do, it's like illustration, you know, well, it's not really art and so on. So there is a big need to open up and evolve in terms of language communication and extension. And I'll stay here. Culture is the overarching word, which is in the title of our panel. Culture is the overarching word that has to do with systemic change, because culture encompasses everything. All these ideas, all these notions go into culture. And we have to develop a vision that is in accordance with the views in these several disciplines, savoir, as the French say, that will allow us to survive.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I hate cutting you off because you're so lovely. So I really don't like to cut you off. But I think there's
nothing else to say.
There's some good points there, right, on art-science relationship and on working with culture, because in fact, you know, culture is language, it's symbols, and a lot of institutions or you know, initiatives that I've seen for structural change, they fall down in dealing with mentality, right, in the implementation of dealing with diverse mentalities. And on that note, Barry Gills put a great thing in the chat. It's about creating sort of a future forum of new narratives, processes, institutions, mentalities, practices. And I think if we really go into that, you know, we're talking both art science at a very deep level, art in terms of the processes that Nora Bateson was talking about, practices, local, global, institutions, right? Incredible, like what Petra's talking about with the new economic architecture, right? In fact, just in the work that I've done, essentially a lot of activism could be much more structural, that activism is no longer just about NGOs, it's about really game-changing innovations that are creating new models, new modus operandi, but also working with all the emergent life systems that Nora Bateson's talking about. So I just want to throw this out here because I know we don't have much time left. There is this group on identifying transformations in narratives, processes, institutions, mentalities, practices. Maybe we can showcase some good examples, come up with best practices, identify, you know, warm data, interrelationships. You know, is that it just throwing this out there as a possible, because I know one of the objectives for Gary and was can we make this a working group, and what are just throwing that out there as a concept for a working group, you know, to build a potential project. How does everybody feel about that? All these brilliant people, I want to hear what you think in 9 minutes.
I think that's what the final question was that you sent us. You know, what do we propose to the World Academy as to you know, the next step of action that we can do as a collective, you know, that we do together creatively and contribute to the change we want to see a reality, been made reality. So I think so. I mean, I'm strongly for it. We can propose to the Academy that this be created as a project. I mean, years ago, I was part of the New Economic Theory group, and we had some very productive meetings, example, in Dubrovnik. And then we wrote a joint paper together that was in Cadmus about new economic theory. I mean, we were one of many groups around the world that were trying to, rewrite the economic textbook, the paradigm shift, which is absolutely imperative and necessary if we're going to survive. So, I think this is the next one because, so many people, that's a global conversation engaged with many different ways already, well in motion. Everyone's thinking that, yeah, that's the question, coming out of COVID, coming out of our current problem, a world that's really radically different. But, as Frank was saying, you've got to have a much more clear understanding of what that entails. So that we can work on it. I think we should. It's a really good project for the Academy. And
I think it's a good project for the Academy. And I think if we take the key insights here, right, so that we set it up in that way, right? So what Petra was talking about with participation, right? And the art science relationship, if we look at that the creative part is not something we're going to do on the side as a performance. In fact, the best performances come from amazing artistic processes that happen between the people creating them. So if we understand that the creativity is baked in from the beginning, right? That the arts and the attention to the relationships and the creativity, we're baking that in from the beginning and we're allowing it that emergent type of space. But at the same time, I'll work on my metrics, right? Petra will have her new architecture that, everything's going to be evolving. But can we come up within that group, some nice models? I want to see Nora Bateson's warm data model, Petra's new model for economy, which is just so super cool. Frank's systems change investing model. And in fact, I think what will enable us to come together is by keeping the space very emergent. But at the same time, everyone keep their individual metrics and data going. And then we can see, how to build the strategies and the processes. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud. I'm not telling people what to do. I'm just thinking out loud at what could be the process.
I love the idea. I think the idea of the Future Transformation Forum is excellent, where we would look at, as some of the other suggestions, insights from nature, insights from the indigenous, look at what are the processes that are working, identifying the specific changes. Julene, you discussed setting up an online group. Maybe that's one way that we could facilitate the operation of the forum, but I think that's a great idea. Just as a general comment, I heard so many wonderful ideas on this panel, and and there's many other like us, and at times you think, how can you possibly integrate all these good ideas? But in nature, that's the way nature works. Thousands of different things happen at once, seemingly independent, and it winds up as a coordinated solution. So we are being, we are being guided. Joseph Campbell said that, there's one truth said 1,000 different ways, or that the best things can't be said. And, our minds can't understand everything and how to bring it together, but our hearts know everything. We can know stuff in our heart without being able to say it. So I think this panel has just been a manifestation of the wisdom of nature speaking through each one of us. And I love the idea of the Future Transformations Institute. I think that we could recommend that during the session for future work tomorrow.
Yeah.
If you all agree.
It seems like the chat messages. Yeah, go ahead, jump in. Yeah.
Just a little piece about this. I think sure, it's definitely worthwhile. I think because of how we started this discussion that's brought us together, the urgency of the climate chaos and the situation we're in on the increasing authoritarianism, shrinking civil society space, I would recommend that there is the first phase might actually do some gathering of information, a survey of the field. How many other platforms like this are out there? How do you integrate or set up at least communication nodes or threads between what is happening in other places rather than completely starting from scratch or reinventing? And I know that since we all represent quite a diverse constituency and little nodes ourselves, that should be fairly doable, but I just want to make sure that it's an intentional step of assessment. I mean, one of the things that I do a lot of is work with activists and social movement folks, people who know that there's something wrong. We help them articulate a grievance so that they can understand who can actually deliver the change that they want and how it can happen. And then also do the assessment of, who are the players, the stakeholders, the allies, the opponents, whatever you want to, all the different words people use, and the situations both internally and externally for what's happening. And without this actual assessment, the strategic planning, the big picture is not as helpful as it can be. Like as an artist, the classic thing is somebody's like, oh, just make me a puppet. Everything's going to be fine. I'm going to go parade it out in front of my Capitol building and that will change everything. And that's just not true. Like if we start with the tactics, we don't know where we're headed, and we might actually get there. So I really want to.
I think that's really important, that however we set it up is working in a new model. And definitely we don't want to be a siloed off group. We know what siloed off knowledge, does, right? So we want to have key information flows, coming from different groups on the ground. Culture will probably also come into it in terms of your idea will be implemented in one context, my idea will be implemented in a different context, right? But definitely having those information flows on the ground, so we're not thinking in a siloed off way, defining our participation, as Petra was saying, transformative, and really putting our hearts and brains together in an art-science relationship of this process. I don't know if Frank wants to say anything.
And one other thing I'll just add as a facilitator in this crew, actually, when we say this work, how do we transform how we work together and how we collect this data? Like, is it just in a spreadsheet, or are we actually going to be open to collecting information through other ways, music and video and arts expression and acting, and that also should be fascinating.
Well, there's so many good ideas. Maybe one thing we could do is to try and collectively come up with a proposal for WAAS. I could either write something up, or Barry, it was your idea for the forum. If you'd like to write up something short and circulate it with us, we can add our ideas and maybe present it during tomorrow's session.
I'm also wondering, like keeping the structure, information flows, transformative participation, mapping the data. And I'm also wondering if a key part of this forum, for it to be more of, I'm about implementation. I'm sorry, I'm a CEO. But for us to look at models of initiatives, right? Best practices, processes that are working, working in culture, working in context, right? For us to really get more around implementation. I'm just also feeling in on the insights from the global leadership project that WAAS are doing and UN are pushing implementation. Show us how, right? So for us to also bring that practical element into it, would be valuable, I think.
Definitely. We don't have a lot of time. We've got to get busy. So what's the practical?
All right. Thank you everyone for your brilliance, for your contributions, for your being, and I think I guess me and Frank will follow up. Frank, you can start by just drafting something, and then maybe we can just all contribute to it and flesh it out, and present it tomorrow because we can. We all going with the flow of life.
Well, thanks to all of you for sharing your wisdom and experience on this panel. It's been wonderful, and I hope this is just the beginning.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Really good conversation. Now we can get going, do something together.